Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack the life of Aurangzeb, the sixth Mughal emperor. We're using a very comprehensive historical overview, a detailed Wikipedia article, actually, to just chart the trajectory of this guy.
Because there's a lot of information out there
A
about it.
massive info overload, and we want to bypass that and distill his incredibly complex life into those key aha moments for you. Because his story is just the ultimate masterclass in how absolute power and, religious conviction and endless ambition can build a superpower.
And then completely destroy it from the inside out.
Exactly. Now, before we go any further, we need to be very, very clear with you. Aurangzeb is a highly polarizing figure today.
Very much so.
Like incredibly politically charged legacies. For some people, he's viewed as this orthodox hero who purified a corrupt state. And for others, he's a bigoted villain who dismantled a culture of tolerance. So we want to explicitly state that we're not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
We aren't endorsing any modern political viewpoints. Our job is simply to impartially report and synthesize the facts, the arguments, and the multiple perspectives that are in our source material.
Yeah, we're just unpacking the history. You make up your own mind.
Exactly. So to understand the psychology of this emperor who ruled from 1658 to 1707, where do we even start?
Well, you have to look at the environment that forged him, right? So Muhi al-Din Muhammad, who eventually takes the title Aurangzeb, he was born in 1618.
Okay.
He was a direct descendant of Timur, born into just the absolute pinnacle of royalty to Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal.
Which, that sounds like a life of supreme privilege.
You'd think so.
Like, his parents are literally the famous couple behind the Taj Mahal.
Right, the ultimate romantic legacy.
Yeah. But his childhood was actually basically a masterclass in psychological warfare and survival, because when he was just 8 years old, his father staged a massive, unsuccessful rebellion against Aurangzeb's grandfather, the Emperor Jahangir.
Yeah, Jahangir was a formidable ruler in his own right. And, honestly, rebellions within the Mughal dynasty were somewhat baked into the system. It was kind of expected.
Just a family tradition at that point.
Pretty much. So when Shah Jahan's rebellion collapsed, he was forced into this really humiliating pardon. And as a condition of that surrender, young Aurangzeb and his brother Darashiko were separated from their parents.
At 8 years old?
At 8. And they were sent to Lahore as political hostages.
Wow.
Yeah, they were placed in the custody of their grandfather and his deeply influential wife, Nur Jahan.
That dynamic is completely wild to me. You are 8 years old, and you are literally serving as human collateral in a lethal power struggle.
Yeah.
You're living in the court of the man your dad just tried to dethrone. I have to imagine that environment acts like a biological pressure cooker.
Oh, absolutely.
It strips away any illusion of childhood safety. It just replaces it with this hypervigilant, cold calculus about how power is acquired and lost. It's like a high-stakes corporate family drama, like the show Succession, but with literal war elephants and child hostages.
That's actually a great analogy. It undeniably shaped his worldview. Being a hostage in a 17th century imperial court meant being constantly observed, constantly evaluated.
Just walking on eggshells every single day.
Exactly. You're perpetually aware that your life depends on political winds that are entirely out of your control. So he learned really early on that trust was a liability.
Which makes sense. Does this early trauma and this Khmer superiority complex he develops kind of explain why he eventually turned on his own family?
I think it's a huge part of it. He was reunited with his father a few years later after Jahangir died, and Shah Jahan won the ensuing struggle for the throne. So suddenly, Aurangzeb was a prince again.
Right. Back in the lap of luxury.
Right. He's granted a daily allowance of 500 rupees, which was a fortune, and subjected to this intensely rigorous education.
He was smart, too.
Incredibly brilliant. He mastered Arabic, Persian, Chagatai Turkic, Hindustani. He memorized the Quran. He studied advanced military strategy.
And that military strategy part becomes very relevant very quickly, right?
Yeah.
There's this incident from his teenage years that seems to perfectly distill his entire psychological makeup.
Oh, the elephant incident.
Yes. It happened in 1633 when he's around 14 or 15 years old.
Right.
The imperial camp was hosting an elephant fight, which was, a standard display of royal power back then.
A spectacle.
But one of the massive war elephants, this animal named Sudhakar, suddenly just went entirely out of control and charged directly at the young princes.
And a modern war elephant is essentially an unstoppable force of nature. I mean, it stampeded through the encampment, scattering guards and nobles
Yeah,
alike.
absolute chaos.
Total chaos. But in the face of this charging beast, Aurangzeb did not retreat.
At 15.
At 15, he held his ground, rode his horse directly toward the elephant, and hurled his spear at its head.
That is just insane bravery.
It is. The elephant retaliated, of course, and swatted Aurangzeb right off his horse. He was completely exposed on the ground.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he came within inches of being trampled to death before the guards finally managed to distract the animal.
And his family, understandably, reprimanded him for taking such an insane risk. Like, what are you doing?
Right, you almost died.
But his response is what really sticks with me. He reportedly said, "Death drops the curtain even on emperors. It is no dishonor. The shame lay in what my brothers did."
Just openly mocking them.
Mocking his brothers for not helping him. He weaponized his own near-death experience to assert dominance over his sibling.
It's so telling. That quote reveals the bedrock of his character. It shows this deep-seated fatalism, this belief that the time of one's death is predetermined by God, so fear is just irrelevant.
Right.
But more importantly, like you said, it highlights his contempt for his brothers. He publicly shamed them, signaling that he already viewed them not as family, but as cowardly inferiors.
And his father, Shah Jahan, rewarded him for it.
He did.
He gave Aurangzeb 5,000 mohars, those gold coins, the title Bahadur, meaning brave, and he actually gifted him the very elephant that had nearly killed him.
Which is such a brilliant psychological maneuver by the father.
Isn't it essentially saying, you conquered the beast, so you own the beast?
Yeah. But that dynamic with his brothers, that simmering resentment and superiority, that would dictate the fate of the entire empire. Because, as we touched on, within the Mughal system, the transition of power was never peaceful.
Right, there's no primogeniture. The oldest son doesn't just automatically get the crown.
Exactly. The Mughals followed a Turco-Mongol tradition where every prince believed he had an equal claim to the empire. It was an institutionalized, bloody free-for-all.
Basically an evolutionary bottleneck. It was designed to ensure only the most ruthless and militarily capable son took control. Right? The throne or the funeral bier.
That was the saying. Sons traditionally fought to the death. And by 1657, Shah Jahan had 4 adult sons. They were all serving as governors of these vast different provinces, commanding their own massive armies, and just waiting for the inevitable clash.
And Shah Jahan heavily favored his eldest son, Dara Shikoh.
He did. Dara was positioned in the capital, acting as a co-regent. And Dara was this renowned intellectual. He was deeply invested in comparative religion. He actually translated the Upanishads from Sanskrit into Persian.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he sought this philosophical middle ground between Hinduism and Islam, very much in the tradition of their great-grandfather Akbar.
So Dara sounds like the ideal philosopher king on paper, but while Dara was in the capital hosting philosophical debates, Aurangzeb was out in the mud.
Exactly.
He had spent decades as a military commander. He was the viceroy of the Deccan, fighting these brutal campaigns. He governed Gujarat. He fought the Uzbeks in Central Asia. He understood logistics and siege warfare and just the grueling reality of leading men in hostile territory.
The contrast could not have been starker. And when analyzing this conflict, it's really tempting to frame it as a purely ideological battle, right?
The liberal intellectual versus the orthodox conservative.
Right, but while theology played a role, historians emphasize that the mechanics of Mughal power weren't purely about ideology. The nobility chose sides based on military competence.
And Dara was a poor general.
A terrible general.
Uh-huh.
He was arrogant, inexperienced, and he had alienated much of the military elite. Aurangzeb, on the other hand, was a battle-hardened commander.
So what kicks off the actual war?
In 1657, Shah Jahan suddenly falls violently ill with strangury.
Which is a severely painful blockage of the urinary tract, right?
Yes. He was completely incapacitated, and rumors quickly spread across all the provinces that the emperor was actually dead and Dara was just hiding the truth to seize power.
Of course. So the other brothers immediately mobilize, but Aurangzeb doesn't just march blindly in. He executes this masterclass in political maneuvering.
He's very calculated.
He reaches out to his younger brother, Murad, who had already declared himself emperor in Gujarat, and Aurangzeb proposes an alliance. He suggests, hey, let's defeat Dara, partition the empire between us, and then I'll just go off and pursue a life of religious asceticism.
Which was a brilliant, completely deceptive piece of diplomacy.
A total lie.
A total lie. The combined, battle-tested armies of Aurangzeb and Murad marched north and intercepted Dara's much larger but hastily assembled and poorly commanded army. This was the Battle of Samagar in May 1658.
And despite having the ideological backing of their father, Dara just gets crushed. Right?
It was a disaster for Dara. His tactical blunders, combined with Aurangzeb's superior artillery and cavalry coordination, led to a complete rout. Dara fled for his life.
So with the military obstacle removed, Aurangzeb drops the ascetic facade immediately.
Instantly.
He betrays Murad, invites him to a celebratory feast, gets him heavily intoxicated, and has him thrown in chains.
Yeah, Murad was imprisoned in the Gwalior fort and later executed on a highly convenient murder charge.
It's just cold-blooded. And then he marches into the capital. But his father, Shah Jahan, had actually recovered from his illness by this point.
He had. But Aurangzeb just declared his father incompetent to rule and placed him under permanent house arrest in the Agra fort.
Imprisoning his own dad for 8 years.
8 years. Shah Jahan spent the rest of his life confined, cared for by his daughter Jahanara, supposedly just spending his days staring out the window at the Taj Mahal.
That is deeply tragic. But Dara was still out there, right?
He was, and Aurangzeb relentlessly hunted him across the empire. Dara was eventually betrayed by an Afghan chieftain that he had previously saved, actually.
Ouch.
Yeah, he was bound in chains, paraded through the streets of Delhi on a filthy elephant. Then in 1659, Aurangzeb had Dara executed.
And the official charge brought by a council of clerics was apostasy, right? Claiming Dara's syncretic religious views made him an infidel.
That was the official reason. But the real mechanism of the execution was entirely political. He had to eliminate the rival.
But the way he did it, to finalize his absolute supremacy, Aurangzeb had Dara's head severed, placed in a velvet box, and delivered to their imprisoned father.
It's a striking, horrific image.
Sending your captive father the severed head of his favorite son, that just defies comprehension. It forces us to confront this massive paradox.
Which one?
Well, the historical sources emphasize Aurangzeb's intense personal piety. Like, he strictly observed Islamic law, spent hours in prayer, and manually copied the Quran. So how does a man who is so devoutly religious justify overthrowing his father and murdering his brothers in cold blood?
It's a great question. The justification really lies in the concept of state preservation. In the context of Mughal realpolitik, allowing rival claimants to live just guaranteed endless civil war, which would tear the Muslim empire apart.
So he sees himself as the savior.
Exactly. He likely viewed himself as the necessary, brutal instrument of divine will, tasked with saving the empire from Dara's alleged heresies and the chaos of succession. But I will say, this move was deeply unpopular.
I bet.
Even the chief Qazi, the highest Islamic judge in the empire, initially refused to legitimize Aurangzeb's ascension. Overthrowing a living father was a severe violation of Islamic law. So Aurangzeb really had to cultivate support among the Orthodox clergy and frame himself as the sole defender of the faith to legitimize a reign that was born in such violence.
Okay, so he secures the throne through sheer force and political terror. But we really need to look at what exactly he won. He took control of the Mughal economy, which at this point in history was just an absolute colossus.
The scale of the Mughal economy under Aurangzeb is honestly difficult to conceptualize today.
It's massive.
The empire spanned over 4 million square kilometers, encompassing a population of over 158 million people.
The numbers are staggering. The treasury raised an annual revenue of 450 million rupees. For a frame of reference for you listening, that was more than 10 times the annual revenue of his French contemporary, the absolute monarch, King Louis XIV.
10 times.
The Mughal Empire actually overtook King China to become the largest economy on the planet, representing 25% of the world's GDP.
Right, and we're looking at a period historians define as proto-industrialization. This wasn't just a simple agrarian society. The Mughal Empire was the manufacturing hub of the world, particularly when it came to textiles and shipbuilding.
Yeah, contemporary European travelers like the French physician François Bernier, they documented the existence of these massive carkhanas.
The manufactories.
Right, the state-sponsored and privately owned manufactories employing hundreds of specialized artisans working in this highly organized, almost assembly line fashion.
Churning out silk brocades, fine muslins, pashmina shawls. These are the luxury goods of the era, desperately sought after in the markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam.
The European trading companies were essentially just funneling vast amounts of silver from the New World directly into Aurangzeb's treasury just to buy Indian textiles.
Exactly. But, the administration required to manage an economy of that scale, collecting taxes across thousands of villages, maintaining trade routes, managing the complex mansabdari system where nobles were ranked and assigned lands. It required an enormous bureaucracy.
A massive corporate ladder, basically.
Yeah. And this brings us to one of the most counterintuitive, surprising statistics of Aurangzeb's reign.
Yes, the paradox.
He is universally known for his strict Orthodox Islamic policies. Yet during his rule, the number of Hindus serving in the imperial administration actually dramatically increased.
It seems completely contradictory. Between 1679 and 1707, the proportion of Hindu officials in his bureaucracy rose by half, reaching almost 32%.
Yeah, 31.6% to be exact.
Why would a ruler who supposedly wanted to create this puritanical Islamic state hire more Hindus than his famously tolerant predecessors did?
The mechanism driving this was territorial expansion, not ideological pluralism. It was pure realpolitik.
How?
Well, Aurangzeb was obsessed with pushing the empire's borders south into the Deccan Plateau. And the Deccan was a vastly different geographical and political landscape than the northern plains. To secure these new territories, he couldn't just rely on his North Muslim nobility.
He didn't know the area.
Right. He needed the local elites, specifically the Marathas and the Rajputs, who understood the local revenue systems, the terrain, the regional power dynamics. He absorbed them into his administration through sheer necessity. By the end of his reign, Maratha commanders actually outnumbered Rajputs in the imperial court.
It's like a modern multinational corporation, right? You implement these strict ideological internal policies at headquarters, but then you simultaneously hire thousands of foreign contractors just to keep the local supply chains running.
That's a perfect way to look at it. It's the ultimate triumph of economics over ideology.
And managing those supply lines required an incredibly complex tax system. He was a notorious micromanager.
Oh, extreme micromanager. Early in his reign, he actually attempted to stimulate the economy by abolishing over 80 different local taxes, tolls, and cesses that he felt were un-Islamic or just overly burdensome on merchants and peasants.
He abolished 80 taxes.
Yeah. He was reading endless reports from provincial news writers every day. But as his military campaigns in the south bogged down into these endless wars of attrition, the financial drain became catastrophic.
Wars are expensive.
Very. He was forced to constantly revise his revenue demands, squeezing the agricultural base harder and harder.
And that economic pressure, combined with his shifting internal policies, sets the stage for the most fiercely debated aspect of his legacy.
The religious policies.
Exactly. Because while he compromised on who he hired for the bureaucracy, he absolutely did not compromise on his religious vision for the empire.
No, he didn't. Aurangzeb completely abandoned the concept of the emperor as a semi-divine, universal ruler, which was a concept championed by Akbar. Instead, he aligned himself closely with the Mujahideen order.
What's that?
It was a specific branch of Naqshbandi Sufism that had emerged as a conservative reaction against Akbar's religious syncretism. The theology basically argued that the state's primary function was to enforce the Sharia, the Islamic law, in its most orthodox form.
And he implemented this vision through a series of highly disruptive edicts. Like, he banned the celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year.
Yeah.
He forbade music at the court, dismissing hundreds of court musicians. In 1663, he outlawed sati, the Hindu practice where a widow was immolated on her husband's funeral pyre.
And he also commissioned the Fatawa Alamgiri, bringing together hundreds of Islamic jurists to create this massive standardized legal code intended to serve as the definitive reference for the empire.
But the policy that sent the largest shockwave through the empire was the reimposition of the jizya in 1679.
Yes. The jizya was a classical Islamic tax levied on non-Muslim subjects, theoretically in exchange for state protection and exemption from military service. It had been suspended a century earlier by his great-grandfather Akbar.
Reversing a 100-year-old policy of tolerance seems like a guaranteed way to incite rebellion. Even members of his own family and his high-ranking nobles warned him against it. So why do it? If he's a pragmatist, why?
Well, modern historical consensus looks at the timing. By 1679, the empire was facing severe economic strain from those Deccan Wars, and Aurangzeb was facing mounting political opposition.
Ah, so he needed the money and the friends.
Exactly. Reimposing the tax achieved two goals simultaneously. It provided a much-needed infusion of cash into the treasury, and it solidified his backing among the Orthodox clerics, whose support he really needed to maintain his legitimacy.
But let's look at the mechanics of the jizya, because it wasn't just a universal flat tax, right? The bureaucratic reality of applying this across millions of people was immensely complicated.
Very complicated. The tax code contained a slew of specific exemptions.
Who was exempt?
Women, children, the elderly, the chronically ill, the blind, the unemployed, and those living in extreme poverty were legally exempt.
Yeah.
Crucially, anyone employed by the state, which included that massive number of Hindu bureaucrats and soldiers we just discussed, was also exempt.
Okay, so it didn't hit everyone, but for the urban merchants and artisans who did have to pay, it was deeply oppressive.
Extremely.
Beyond the financial burden, the collection method was intentionally designed to reinforce social hierarchy. The taxpayer often had to present the money in person to the collector, sometimes subjected to verbal humiliations intended to remind them of their subordinate status.
Right, and the economic disparity was glaring. Hindu merchants were taxed at 5% on their goods, while Muslim merchants paid only 2.5%, and eventually the tax on Muslim merchants was abolished altogether.
That caused massive protests in Delhi. It actually drove many skilled artisans and merchants to relocate to the coastal territories controlled by the European trading companies.
Capital flight, essentially.
Exactly. But the tax policy is only half the controversy. The other half involves the physical destruction of religious sites.
And this is the focal point of the modern debate. Court chronicles from Aurangzeb's reign explicitly mention imperial orders to destroy temples. The most prominent examples occurred in 1669 and 1670.
He ordered the demolition of the Vishwanath Temple in Varanasi, which is one of the holiest sites in Hinduism.
Yes. And following a violent Jat rebellion in Mathura, he ordered the destruction of the Kesava Deo Temple, constructing an Edga, an open-air mosque, right on the site. He also targeted schools in regions like Multan and Fateh, ordering his governors to destroy institutions where Brahmins were teaching what he termed false books.
Now, these actions read like straightforward religious persecution, just religious bigotry, but the historical sources suggest the causality is a bit more complicated, right?
It is. The destruction of a temple wasn't just a theological statement, it was a highly political one. In the pre-modern Indian political framework, patronizing a massive, wealthy temple was a primary way for a local king or noble to assert their sovereignty and legitimacy. Therefore, when the Mughal state faced a rebellion, destroying the temple associated with the rebel leader was a direct, devastating attack on their political authority.
Okay, so they were targeted because they were centers of political rebellion.
Right. For example, the Vishwanath Temple had strong ties to the Rajput leader Jai Singh, whose family was suspected of aiding the escape of a major rebel from Mughal custody. Temples in Marwar and Mewar were destroyed during active military campaigns against Rajput uprisings. Historians argue that Aurangzeb generally did not destroy temples in peaceful areas that submitted to his rule. The destruction was deployed as a punitive measure against political defiance.
And we actually see that duality in his own royal decrees, his firmans.
We do.
Because at the exact same time his armies are tearing down temples in rebellious provinces, Aurangzeb is issuing state funds and land grants to maintain other Hindu temples and Jain religious sites.
Yes. He provided state protection for the Mahakaleshwar Temple in Ujjain and the Umananda Temple in Guwahati. He even explicitly ordered that existing temples in Varanasi should not be harassed, although he did forbid the construction of new ones.
It creates a deeply contradictory picture. It seems like his policies were a mix of appeasing Orthodox clerics and addressing real politic constraints, rather than just pure zealotry. He was perfectly willing to support non-Muslim institutions when they were politically useful, but he ruthlessly dismantled them the moment they became vectors for resistance.
Exactly.
But I have to push back here.
Go ahead.
I understand the theory of temples as centers of political sovereignty, but when you look at his treatment of religious figures, the realpolitik argument starts to feel a bit insufficient.
You're talking about the executions.
Yes. If the jizya and the temples were just realpolitik, how do we explain the targeted executions for blasphemy and heresy? He executed the Sufi mystic Sarmad Kashani for alleged heresy. He executed the spiritual head of the Dawoodi Bohra sect. And most consequentially, he ordered the execution of the 9th Sikh guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, in 1675.
Yeah, that's a massive turning point. The execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur is a critical inflection point in Indian history. According to Sikh tradition, the Guru had been approached by Kashmiri Pandits pleading for protection against forced religious conversions.
Right.
The Guru traveled toward Delhi to confront the emperor's policies. He was arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to severe torture in an attempt to force him to convert to Islam. When he steadfastly refused, he was publicly beheaded in Chandni Chowk in Delhi.
Executing a widely revered spiritual leader is an incredibly aggressive move. If Aurangzeb was just a pragmatic politician, why take an action guaranteed to outrage an entire community?
Because in Aurangzeb's view, and in the prevailing logic of the Mughal state at the time, there was no separation between religious authority and political authority.
They were one and the same.
Exactly. A leader who could command the absolute loyalty of thousands of followers, independent of the state, was by definition a political threat. The state could not tolerate an alternate center of power. However, pragmatism or not, the execution was a catastrophic strategic blunder.
Oh, totally.
It did not suppress the Sikh community. It radically transformed it.
It ignited a powder keg. Following the execution, Guru Tegh Bahadur's young son became the 10th Sikh guru, Guru Gobind Singh, and he realized that peaceful spiritualism would not survive the Mughal state. So in 1699, he established the Khalsa.
Right, fundamentally militarizing the faith.
Yes. He transformed his followers into a warrior community dedicated to resisting tyranny. He later actually penned the Zafarnama, which is this brilliant, defiant letter written in Persian directly to Aurangzeb, dissecting the emperor's hypocrisy and accusing him of betraying the true moral tenets of Islam. This single execution basically birthed a martial force that would eventually dismantle Mughal power in the Punjab.
And the Sikhs were just one front. Whether driven by economics or religion, Aurangzeb's policies and his insatiable appetite for territory sparked a firestorm of resistance across the subcontinent. He was fighting a multi-front war against his own subjects.
Let's talk about the Jats.
Right, and an agrarian community around Mathura. They had rebelled earlier in 1669, driven to desperation by aggressive agricultural taxation and the destruction of local temples. Aurangzeb suppressed that initial uprising, capturing their leader Gokula and having his limbs hacked off in Agra.
But the Jats regrouped. Years later, under a new leader named Raja Ramjot, they launched an insurgency that culminated in one of the most shocking acts of desecration in the empire's history.
It's unbelievable.
They didn't just attack a Mughal fort, they literally attacked the tomb of Emperor Akbar in Sikandra.
The symbolism of that attack cannot be overstated. Akbar was the architect of the Mughal imperial system. The Jat rebels overpowered the guards, stripped the mausoleum of its gold, silver, and precious carpets, and then, according to contemporary accounts, they dug up Akbar's bones and threw them into a fire.
They dug up his great-grandfather.
Burned the bones, yeah.
Burning the remains of the emperor's revered ancestor. It is a level of visceral hatred that shows how deeply Aurangzeb's policies had alienated the populace. He eventually had Raja Ramjot hunted down and killed, but the damage to Mughal prestige was permanent.
And meanwhile, to the west, he had alienated the Rajputs, who were the traditional military backbone of the Mughal army. When the ruler of Marwar died, Aurangzeb attempted to manipulate the succession, trying to install his own puppet and demanding the infant heirs be raised at the Mughal court.
Which didn't go well.
No.
Yeah.
This triggered a bitter 30-year guerrilla war led by the Rajput hero Durgadas Rathore that just bled Mughal resources in the desert.
But his most lethal, most intractable enemy lay to the south, the Marathas.
Led by the legendary warrior Shivaji.
The conflict between Aurangzeb and Shivaji is the defining clash of the era. Aurangzeb commands this massive, slow-moving, heavily armored imperial war machine. But Shivaji commands light cavalry. He uses the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Western Ghats to his advantage. He launches these rapid hit-and-run attacks, disrupts supply lines, and just vanishes before the Mughal heavy artillery could even be positioned.
Shivaji essentially invented modern guerrilla warfare in India.
He really did.
The Mughals were accustomed to fighting pitched battles on open plains. They were entirely unprepared for an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. In 1659, Shivaji executed one of the most audacious raids in military history.
Oh, the night raid.
Yes. The Mughal viceroy, Shaista Khan, had occupied the city of Pune. In the middle of the night, Shivaji and a small band of men infiltrated the heavily guarded Mughal camp, broke into the viceroy's quarters, killed his son, and in the ensuing melee, Shivaji personally severed 3 of Shaista Khan's fingers with his sword before escaping into the darkness.
Just chopped off his fingers and vanished. The psychological impact of that raid was immense. It proved the Mughals were not invincible. So Aurangzeb eventually realized he couldn't defeat Shivaji militarily, so he tried diplomacy. He invited Shivaji to the imperial court in Agra, promising him safe passage.
But Aurangzeb miscalculated the cultural dynamics. When Shivaji arrived, Aurangzeb made him stand behind lower-ranking nobles. It was an intended slight to remind the Maratha leader of his subordinate status.
Which Shivaji did not take well.
Not at all. He was infuriated by the insult and stormed out of the court. Aurangzeb immediately placed him under house arrest.
And then Shivaji orchestrates a legendary escape, supposedly smuggling himself and his son out of the heavily guarded compound hidden inside large baskets of sweets that were meant for local priests.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does. He makes it back to the Deccan, assumes the title of Chhatrapati Independent Monarch, and completely neutralizes Mughal power in the region.
And even after Shivaji died, the conflict didn't end. Aurangzeb managed to capture Shivaji's son, Sambhaji, in 1689. Sambhaji was brought before the emperor, paraded in clown clothes, and subjected to a gruesome execution. He was tortured and hacked to pieces by a panel of clerics for the crime of killing Muslims during his raids.
Aurangzeb likely believed that executing the king would break the rebellion.
But it did the exact opposite. Without a central king to capture, the Maratha resistance became a decentralized insurgency. Led by figures like Sambhaji's widow, Taubai, Maratha bands operated independently across the Deccan, turning the entire southern half of the Indian subcontinent into a quagmire for the Mughal army.
And while he's fighting this endless war in the south, Aurangzeb suddenly has to deal with a crisis on the global stage too.
Right, the pirates.
Yes. The Mughal Empire was deeply integrated into the global economy. They were conducting massive maritime trade with the Ottoman Empire and the Arabian Peninsula, but they didn't maintain a strong deep-water navy. They relied instead on European ships for safe passage.
Which was a major vulnerability. And it was exploited by the English pirate Henry Every. In 1695, Every intercepted the Gaji Sawai, which was the largest, most heavily armed ship in the Mughal fleet.
The ultimate prize.
Yeah, the ship was returning from Mecca, carrying high-ranking imperial officials, pilgrims, and a literal fortune in gold and silver. Every captured the ship, plundered the treasure, and committed horrific atrocities against the passengers.
When news of the attack reached Aurangzeb, he was incandescent with rage. But he didn't just view it as a random pirate attack. He held the English East India Company structurally responsible.
You did.
He unleashes the full economic and military weight of the empire. He orders his forces to surround the East India Company's factories in Surat and other ports. He throws their officials in chains where they are nearly lynched by furious mobs. He orders his admiral to blockade Bombay. Aurangzeb essentially threatens to permanently eradicate the English presence in India.
And the East India Company was terrified. I mean, they were a corporate entity, not a sovereign state, and they were entirely dependent on Mughal goodwill for their profits. They had no choice but to completely capitulate.
They had to beg.
Literally. Their envoys were forced to prostrate themselves before the emperor, begging for forgiveness. They agreed to pay massive financial reparations, amounting to over 600,000 rupees, and pledged to provide armed escorts for all future pilgrim ships. They also launched the first global manhunt in history to find Henry Every, though he disappeared with the loot.
It is a stark reminder of the geopolitical reality of the time. Long before the British Empire colonized India, a Mughal emperor could bring the most powerful corporation on earth to its knees simply by threatening to cut off their market access.
Yeah, the power imbalance was completely in Aurangzeb's favor.
But despite the empire's vast resources and advanced technology, its internal mechanics were beginning to fracture. Let's talk about the military tech for a second.
Okay, yeah. The Mughal military was incredibly advanced. They deployed massive composite cannons, like the Zafarbash,
Right.
which required highly sophisticated metallurgy, combining wrought iron forge welding with bronze casting. They had thousands of war elephants and highly trained musketeers.
But all of this heavy machinery was basically useless against the asymmetric warfare of the Marathas.
Exactly. And when they did use it for conventional warfare, the cost was astronomical. Take the siege of Golconda in 1687.
This is a crazy story.
Aurangzeb wanted to conquer the wealthy Kudaki dynasty. But the Golconda fortress was an engineering marvel. It was built on a solid granite hill 400 feet high, encircled by an 8-mile wall designed to deflect artillery fire and withstand elephant charges.
The Mughal army surrounds the fort, but they can't breach it. They were forced to endure an 8-month siege. In the dead of night, they attempted to construct these massive, elaborate wooden scaffolding structures just to scale the sheer granite walls, only to have the defenders burn it down.
The Mughal camp was ravaged by starvation and disease during this.
It was a disaster. Aurangzeb only managed to take the fort through bribery, paying a traitor to open a gate in the middle of the night. He captured the fort, and with it, the Collar Mine, which is the source of the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond.
So he wins the battle. He conquers Golconda, he conquers Bijapur, and he pushes the Mughal borders to their absolute maximum historical extent. But at what cost?
Right. Which brings us to the final, devastating chapter of his life. Aurangzeb spent the last 26 years of his life personally commanding the Deccan campaign. He abandoned the magnificent capital cities of Delhi and Agra. Instead, he ruled from a moving military encampment.
And when we say camp, we have to discard any modern notion of the word.
It's not a few tents.
No. Think of it more like a black hole slowly drifting across the landscape, crushing the local agrarian economy under its gravitational pull. Historians estimate this moving capital was 30 miles in circumference.
30 miles.
30 miles wide. It was a sprawling temporary city containing 250 separate bazaars, 500,000 camp followers, soldiers, and administrators.
500,000 people.
It required 50,000 camels and 30,000 elephants just for logistics.
Imagine a 30-mile-wide city dragging itself across the arid Deccan Plateau. It required immense amounts of food and water. It basically stripped the countryside of all its grain, leaving absolutely nothing for the local peasantry.
Which caused massive famine.
Massive. And following the famine came outbreaks of bubonic plague that devastated both the local population and the imperial army.
The human toll is almost difficult to process. It is estimated that during the final decade of the Deccan campaign, the endless warfare, disease, and starvation cost 100,000 lives a year.
100,000 a year.
The empire's wealth, accumulated over generations, was being poured into a bottomless pit of counterinsurgency warfare.
It is the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. The imperial centralization reached its absolute peak, but the structural integrity of the empire just shattered beneath the weight. He conquered the subcontinent, but he broke the machine that allowed him to rule it.
And the deepest tragedy is that Aurangzeb was acutely aware of this collapse. He was not a delusional tyrant blind to his failures.
He knew.
He knew. As he entered his late 80s, his health failing, surrounded by the devastation of his own making, a profound sense of despair set in. He finally died in a military camp near Ahmednagar on March 3, 1707. He was 88 years old.
And the man who ruled an empire of 150 million people, who commanded the greatest treasury in the world, died leaving specific instructions for his funeral. He demanded that no state funds be used.
None. He had saved 300 rupees money he had earned through his own manual labor, quietly knitting caps and copying the Quran in his tent. He directed that this money be given to charity and used to pay for a strictly orthodox, unostentatious burial.
There is no grand mausoleum for Aurangzeb, no Taj Mahal. He is buried in an unmarked, open-air dirt grave in Kuldabad, exposed to the elements, just a few feet away from the shrine of a Sufi saint.
It's a stunning display of asceticism from an absolute monarch.
But the letters he wrote in his final days reveal a man completely crushed by the weight of his own decisions. In a final letter to his son, Azam Shah, Aurangzeb wrote, "I came a stranger into this world, and a stranger I depart. I know nothing of myself, what I am, and for what I am destined. The instant which passed in power has left only sorrow behind it. I have not been the guardian and protector of the empire."
I have not been the guardian and protector of the empire. It's a devastating confession, and it was an accurate prophecy, because the moment he died, the empire collapsed into chaos.
He left no clear mechanism for succession.
Only vague instructions for his sons to partition the territory. And they immediately went to war with each other, just as he had done with his brothers 50 years earlier.
But this time, the state was too weak to survive the civil war. The treasury was empty, the military was exhausted. The Marathas, whom he had failed to crush, surged north and began dismantling Mughal authority.
Within a few decades, the mighty Mughal Empire fractured into regional successor states, and the emperor in Delhi became little more than a figurehead trapped within his own palace walls.
Which leaves us with a deeply fractured historical memory today. How do you summarize a legacy defined by such profound contradictions? When we look at how he is remembered today, the divide is absolute.
It really is. In Pakistan, the narrative often focuses on his religious devotion. Influential figures, like the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, viewed Aurangzeb as a critical figure who attempted to unify the Muslim community in India through orthodox governance.
Right.
In this view, he's a pious hero who fought tirelessly to purify the state and expand the frontiers of Islam, untainted by the secular compromises of his predecessors.
But cross the border into India and the perspective shifts entirely. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru argued that Aurangzeb acted as a sectarian ruler who destroyed the fragile cultural and religious syncretism that held the diverse empire together.
Yeah.
In this view, his rigid enforcement of orthodoxy, his imposition of the jizya, and his destruction of temples sparked the rebellions that ultimately destroyed the empire.
And the historical reality is that both narratives capture a fragment of the truth, but miss the complex mechanics of the whole. He was a ruler who ordered the destruction of Hindu temples, yet employed more Hindus in his government than any ruler before him.
He ruthlessly ordered the execution of his own family members to secure power, yet spent his private hours agonizing over his religious standing and fearing divine judgment.
He was a man of absolute conviction, trying to manage an empire built on compromise.
We followed his incredible journey from a fearless teenager asserting his dominance over a maddened elephant, through his ruthless rise to power and his command of the global economy, all the way down into the grueling, endless wars of the Deccan that bled his empire dry.
His life serves as a profound case study in the architecture of power, and how the very traits that allow a leader to conquer his system can be the exact traits that ensure its collapse.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. We have this image of the most powerful man on earth, sitting in a tent in the middle of a war zone, meticulously copying verses of the Quran by hand, sewing caps for a few pennies to ensure his own burial was paid for with honest labor. He was driven by an unshakable belief in his own moral purity. And that poses a fascinating question. Is it possible that the greatest structural threat to a massive, highly diverse organization isn't necessarily corruption or greed or incompetence? Is it possible that the greatest threat is a leader with an absolute uncompromising certainty in their own moral righteousness?
Oh.
Because when you believe your worldview is divinely ordained, compromise becomes a sin. And in a complex world, the inability to compromise might just be the quickest path to total collapse. Think about that the next time you encounter a demand for absolute ideological purity. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions, look past the simple narratives, and keep exploring the history that shapes our world.